Father, we thank you for your great love towards us. We thank you that we have opportunity to hear your voice, that we may understand your will in this world. We thank you that in spite of how it looks with sin, that your plans are going to be met, your way will be victorious. We thank you now for guiding us in our minds and hearts. May we receive something from you that will show us the way. And we thank you, Lord, for your protection. Guide us as we seek to understand your will. In Jesus' precious name, amen. Well, it looks like the rain has given us some informal time here. We were supposed to be out in the woods today. It's a little drier in here. Because we were going to be out there and we weren't going to have a recorder, someone suggested a subject, and I'm going to move through that today anyhow. We're going to not do the seals today because not everybody's here, and this particular meeting on the seals is the most important meeting we have on the subject, so we're going to wait till we have the group together. Today I want to talk about 3 Thanksgivings. We'll talk about 2 of them in particular, and the third one we'll just kind of see. The first Thanksgiving that we want to look at was one that was called for by Abraham Lincoln. In 1864, he called for a special fast and prayer dealing with Thanksgiving so that the war would be ended. Now, none of us lived back then, so we don't know how horrible that war was. But we'll try to catch a little flavor and why we're even talking about it. On February the 11th, 1865, just a few months later, James White called for a special fast and prayer. As a matter of fact, prayer 3 times during that day for the whole church. And they put it in the Review and Herald, and the General Conference backed him on it, and they asked the whole church to pray for the war to end. On April 9th, Lee surrendered. And in just a couple of weeks after that, Lincoln was assassinated. Now, we're not going to get into all the history of what was going on back then, because some of it is very controversial. People don't want to hear what really was happening back then. It's been taken out of the history books. But I'm going to mention just a few things in connection with Seventh-day Adventism today to see what was going on as far as we can tell from the Bible and the Spirit of prophecy. With that little introduction, I want to back up now, and we'll come back after we're done with what we're doing on the second Thanksgiving that we're going to look at. We'll come back and discuss in detail some of the things that were going on there in Lincoln's time. First of all, let's go back to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was born in 1482. Okay. A fellow by the name of William Tyndale was born the very next year in England. Luther was born in Germany. Tyndale was born in England. So we had these 2 men born within a year of each other. They don't know each other. And they're coming up. We know that what Luther's part was in the Reformation. And we know a little bit about Tyndale. Tyndale realized that the Bible needed to be in the language of the people. So he decided that was his work. But he found out he couldn't do it where he was because the church people were on him. He had to leave. So he went over to Germany. And while he was in Germany, within 1 year, he had the New Testament done. And they began printing them because they had a printing press to work with now. And the printing press came along just at the right time in history so that Luther could do his work, Tyndale could do his work, and all the other ones. And the Bible that we have today in the King James is basically the Tyndale Bible. They didn't change very much in the King James Version. That is the Tyndale Bible, actually. And it was the Great Bible, as it's called, came from his actual work. Tyndale, of course, realized that he was in trouble when they started looking for him, and he had to move around. And those weren't very good days for people who wanted to know the Bible. Without going into his history, we just want to know that Luther and Tyndale both were born at the right time to get their work done at the same time. Tyndale was finally caught up to, and they burned him on Friday the 6th of October, 1536. And his crime was translating the Bible. Now, let's get a hold of some of this because the world has changed. Today, people either don't know these things or they don't remember them because they don't care anymore. All right, so we have Luther and we have Tyndale. In 1553, Mary, the Queen of England, was 37 years old. And Mary was a homely person. She was very narrow-minded, and she was suspicious by nature. She had been reared by a Catholic mother whom kept her away from everything except Catholicism. So Mary didn't know very much about anything, but she was the Queen of England. Now, we have two other kings before her. We know about King Henry VIII, and then his son became the king, and when he died, Mary was the next in line. She told the people, because Protestantism had taken hold in England, that she was going to practice freedom of religion. Everything was going to be fine. She said, you just let me practice my religion my way, and you practice yours your way. And they all thought, that's pretty good. That's okay. So they let her be the queen. They could have stopped it. But they said, no, we'll go ahead. We'll let her be the queen. And of course, as soon as she got in, just as soon as she got in, she let them know, I'm a Catholic, and guess what? Everybody else is going to be Catholic around here too. So immediately she started throwing people in prison. And she started getting the priests into powerful positions. She didn't waste any time at all. Between August and September, right after she became the queen, Ridley, the greatest preacher in London, was imprisoned. Rogers at St. Paul was taken prisoner. And Latimer, probably the most eloquent preacher in the English language, was taken prisoner. And Hooper, a very fine preacher in Gloucester, was taken prisoner. And Coverdale, Saunders, and Bradford were all put in prison. These were the mightiest men in England at that time. And they were Protestant. Now, I want you to remember this, that these people were originally all Catholics. We think Protestant somehow means completely away from... These were Catholic priests, okay, who had become Protestants. They were protesting what the Catholic Church was doing. Okay, so remember, we're not talking about like today, Methodists and Nazarenes and all that. We're talking about everybody's Catholics back there. And if you're going to protest, you've got to do it to the Catholic Church, and they consider you a Catholic doing it. So these men, when they stood up, they faced something. When they were Protestants, that meant we are against what the Catholic Church is doing, and that's all there was around. There was Catholics. Luther, of course, was a Catholic priest. So whenever you think about these men, they were in the Catholic Church, and they found out something was wrong, And they started protesting about what was going on in the Catholic Church. They were protesting. And everyone that protested, their head was on the line because the Catholic Church didn't like anybody interfering with what they were doing. So please keep that in mind. In 1554, the Queen married Philip, the King of Spain, a Catholic country. Okay? And the King of Spain had in his head that everybody would be Catholic too, because they became kings and queens and all that because the Catholic Church said they could be kings and queens. If the Pope said you can't be one, you were in big trouble. So the Pope had everybody under his thumb, and one of the duties of a king was to defend the church. That was a prime duty of the king. Well, she married Philip, the King of Spain. In 1555, she set up a system that we might be familiar with today, not here in our country, but that may be coming too. But she set up a system of informers, spies. And these people would look in the neighborhoods to see who was going to church and who wasn't going to church. Who was doing this protesting thing and who wasn't doing the protesting thing. So all of this was going on, and as soon as they found somebody who was a Protestant, they were in trouble. On February the 4th, a Monday morning, early in the morning, Rogers, one of these preachers I mentioned, was arrested. They came to his house, they took him out of his house, and he didn't know anything before they came for him. They took him out of the house, and they were going to burn him that day. On the way there, his wife had already been up that morning doing something. They had 10 children. And she was standing in the crowd with the 10 children, watching them, taking her husband to go be burned. And he never got to talk to her again. He just waved at her. And they killed him that day, because he was a Protestant. Hooper, when he was taken, he was a fantastic preacher. The people, the congregation, were in tears because they knew what was happening when they came for him now. And they took him to a place to burn, and he died. Maybe I should tell you a little bit more about Hooper. We have histories, reliable histories of how these things happened. By the way, the Catholic Church denies a lot of this. They've changed the books. But Hooper, that night, went to bed. He had his prayers, of course, first, but he went to bed, and then he just went to sleep. He fell asleep like nothing was happening. He had a good night's sleep. And that morning they came for him, and they put a hoop around him, fastened him to the stake, and they put green wood around, and then they set the fire. And of course the green wood wouldn't burn hot or fast. So all they did was burn his feet at first. And the people didn't know this was going on, and he said to the people, "More fire." More fire. And finally they realized it wasn't burning that well, so some of the people came and put some wood on there. But still, it wasn't enough. That wood was green all around him. So slowly he was burning. And as he realized this is not going to be fast, he began praying right there, saying, "Jesus, have mercy on me." He prayed and prayed. His arm fell off. He's still there alive praying. And he was still praying like that until the gums all melted away and receded. For 45 minutes, he stood there in that fire. The people were horrified. Now, the people who were doing this, of course, thought, once the people see what heresy is and how bad it is, they will all be faithful in the church. But the people were horrified. It never dawned on them the Some of these people might think it's pretty horrible. They do this to people. But the church people, it never occurred to them. They just thought they have to see what heresy is and what happens. So anyhow, that was Hooper. Dr. Taylor, they caught him in his own church, and they burned him in his own parish with his people looking on. We know Ridley, perhaps. That one's been written up several places. Ridley was a tremendous preacher. The night before he was to be burned, he had supper with the mayor. I may have mentioned it before to you. And while he was having that supper, he was happy and just eating, and the wife was all upset, and she started crying, and she said, "Why are you crying?" And she couldn't talk. He looked at her and he says, "Don't you know I'm going to be married tomorrow? I'm going to my marriage." Yeah. And so he had a good night's sleep. On the way to be burned, he realized there was somebody else coming behind him. So he looked around. It was Latimer. Now, Latimer was the oldest of the bunch. He was a venerated man, a tremendous preacher, the most eloquent of the whole bunch, a real intellectual and a real spiritual man. And so he ran back there to Latimer to help him because he was stumbling along. And they finally got to the place, and they fastened them next to each other with these rings. And Ridley had tried to comfort Latimer, but when they were actually tied up and the fire was about to be lit, Latimer looked over to Ridley and he said, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." And it never has been. They lit the fire, and Latimer bent over and pulled the fire up into his face. And he died right away. But Ridley, the way they had the fire arranged, it burned him, but it wasn't hot enough either. It just burned his legs. And he was standing there, and he told the people, "It's not enough fire." And so he was burning, and his legs burned off, and he was hanging there with this. And he hadn't died yet. And finally they put more fire, and he died, but he fell over, and his trunk was laying there at the feet of Latimer. Mary died November 17th, 1558, but she already had 288 people burned by that time. We don't know how many she had in prison. There aren't good records of that, but 288 people had already been burned by this woman. When she died, the word just went everywhere, quickly, all over England, word of mouth. And people were saying, "Long live Queen Elizabeth." And the people were happy. They were joyous that this woman was gone now. Maybe it was a coincidence, but Cardinal Pole, her counselor, the one who got her to do all of this, died on the same day. Okay?
Is that Mary Queen of Scots or different Mary?
No, we're not up to her yet. We're going to get there. All right. That's why I have this on the board. We're going to talk about Mary a little bit, the Scots. All right, so she died, and there was joy in England. Well, Queen Elizabeth, this new young queen, had an entirely different temperament. This one was intelligent. She was not a great person as history has made her out to be. The reason history has made her out to be great is because she was surrounded with great men. Where did these great men come from? Well, they had left England when this Catholic thing started happening. Cranmer, who was the archbishop, told them, "Get out of here." You're going to be in trouble if you stay here. Get out of here. And so the cream of the Englishmen who were Protestants left England and went over to Germany and Netherlands, different places. But they were out there. And while they were out there, they were being exposed to other Protestants. And they were developing some depth, learning, having experiences and all this. And these were men of genius. These were men of talent. And God had preserved them this way. So when Elizabeth became the queen, they knew what was happening. God is going to make England the place where Protestantism is going to be preserved. And they all came back from different places, and they surrounded her. And so she had counselors who really knew something. They were brilliant people, and they were wise. And so she had these people around her, and because of them, they made her a great queen. Now, she, of course, had to have something in her to help the situation out, and the fact is that she wanted to go back to what King Edward had done and make Protestantism strong. So the first thing she did as the queen was make all preaching illegal. So who was she neutralizing? The Catholic priests, because they were in complete control. She absolutely wiped out preaching. No more preaching. That gave the Protestants time to start becoming entrenched in their places again. And of course they had Bibles and everything. But the interesting thing is, if a person just looks at history, they can see when the Protestants get back into control, they're giving the people Bibles. When the Catholics get in control, they're burning them. Yeah? Anybody could see it if they just look at it. Well, at this same time, something else happened. Scotland was controlled by the Catholics also. But on May the 2nd, 1559, Knox came back. John Knox. He had been over in France. He'd been different places. He had been studying with Calvins. They knew each other, and he had developed some depth too. But when he found out that Elizabeth was the queen, he made his way back to Scotland. While he was there, well, before he even arrived, the word was out, he's coming back. And there was a big confab of the big shots of the Catholic priests, and they were all together when the word came to them, John Knox is back. And it's an amazing thing that they all got quiet. No one said anything in there. And they all left. Just the mention of his name. They all left. And they knew there was a big problem now. John Knox is back. There are lots of things going on at this time. We're talking about Scotland now, so Mary Stuart is involved here. Mary Stuart, the Queen of the Scots, was married to Francis II, the King of France. And he had one goal: make England Catholic again. And so he figured he would conquer England, and he would put his wife in as the Queen of England, and they would make it a Catholic country again. So that was their goal. Now, Queen Elizabeth was busy doing lots of things herself, but Pius V, realizing what had happened over there, could not have her be the queen, so he issued a bull. Now remember what the days are like. The Catholic of the Vatican determines who can be a king or who can be a queen. If they don't say it, it's no good. He put out a bull and he excommunicated Queen Elizabeth. So what does that say to the Catholic people? Well, she not only is not the queen, but if she's excommunicated, you can kill her. And it's okay with everybody. So he just put the death sentence on her by putting out that bull. Well, of course, they didn't take to that too kindly in England. King Henry VIII had already shown them one trick. When he married illegally and the church wasn't going for it, he decided, I'm not going to listen to the Pope anymore. So he said, I'll be a Catholic, but I don't hear the Pope. And that's the way he was until he died. He wouldn't pay attention to the Pope. He just said, I'm a Catholic. So the people of England decided, we don't need to listen to this Pope's bull. They passed 2 laws. You know where the expression came from now. The 2 laws, one of them was that anyone who says anything against the Queen of England is going to be dealt with, because that's treason. And the second one also had something close to do with that. It was treason to go against the state and promote something that the state said you can't be promoting. So they set up 2 laws to say that Protestants are going to be free here, and anybody who says anything different is going to be in trouble. Now, this, of course, was also to the advantage of the Catholics, because it worked the same for them. They were free to do what they wanted to, except for treason. Okay, now this is important because the people who fought against Queen Elizabeth, according to the Catholic histories, and were dealt with, who were imprisoned and some of them killed, they were martyrs of Christ. But as far as English history is concerned, they were treasonous because they were trying to kill the Queen of England. So you can take a choice on that. Were they martyrs or were they doing treason against the state? All right. About this time, the Jesuits began infiltrating England. And they learned a lot of tricks during this time. There were 2 men in particular that historians have tracked, and every day these men changed who they were. One day they'd be dressed like a Jesuit, the next day they'd be dressed as a carpenter, the next day they'd be a lawyer, whatever. But every day they changed who they were, and they were moving around doing their thing. They infiltrated the Protestant ministry. Yeah, they became Protestant ministers. One of them was preaching, and he said to the congregation, it's terrible that people don't have freedom to read their Bibles. It's terrible, this and that. It's terrible. And he really got them all fired up. And then he left. And they found a piece of paper where he'd been standing. And it was a letter from France. He was a Jesuit. He had infiltrated them. They found him and they dealt with him. But this is the kind of stuff that was going on. The Catholic Church is going to find some way to destroy Protestantism. And infiltration was just one of those things. Well, they tried to kill Queen Elizabeth several times. But the men around her were clever enough. They could always tell when something was up, and they knew how to stop it and deal with those people. One time there was a plot that had been laid for 6 months and involved lots of people. They were going to get her. But one of the closest men to the Queen found out about it, and he tapped into it, and he had his sources. He knew as much about the plot as the people did who were going to do it. So finally, when it came time to do it, he arrested the whole bunch of them, and several of those people were executed. So she was protected. God sent godly men to take care of the Queen during this time, because Protestantism was taking its root in England. It was starting to fail in Germany already. It was having trouble all through Europe. But here, the last people to get a hold of it, the English, are the ones that are going to protect it now. Mary Stuart was part of the plot, this big plot. She was going to be the queen as soon as Elizabeth was killed. They had it already worked out how she would get there and so forth, and the King of France would be involved. Well, they got a hold of the Queen of Scotland. They put her in a tower, and they took her head off. They dealt with her too. No more. So this kind of ruined the plan of the Catholic Church to take over England and have their queen sitting there.
It's interesting that the Hollywood production about Mary, Queen of Scots, makes her out to be the good one, and Elizabeth to be the bad one.
Well, why not? You know, Hollywood is run basically by a witch society. And anything to make God and Christ look bad is the agenda. Philip II was now the king of Spain. And he was a somewhat modern man. He wasn't even built like the people of his time. The people of his time were short, stocky, big boned, all of that. But he was tall, he was thin, he was a modern man as far as his appearance. But he also was modern in another sense. He decided that as king, it was his duty to exterminate heresy where it was found. And he got it in his head he would be the one that the Pope would use to get rid of heresy. He figured it all out, and he said, this shouldn't be too hard. We have 100 million people in our church, the Church of God, the Church of Christ, 100 million people. And there are only 4 million people over there in England. That's their base of Protestantism. They said 100 million against 4 million? What kind of a contest is that? He says, what's the big problem? We're going to get rid of this stuff. So Philip II decided this is the way it's going to happen. So he consulted with the Vatican, with the Pope. And the Pope said, I will donate 1 million crowns of gold to this cause. 1 million crowns. So he decided he was going to do it. In 1584, Philip II converted 2,000 miles of the coastline of Spain into one shipbuilding yard. The whole coastline was to be used in building ships because he was going to set up something to destroy England. He set it up in such a way that all of this vast army he was going to put together would have 6 months of provisions. They'd take it with them, so there'd be no problem. He was going to build 130 ships that would carry 8,000 sailors. He would have 20,000 soldiers transported with that. There were 2,650 pieces of ordnance. And there were 60,000 tons of carrying weight. There were 2,000 slaves. The planks of the big ships, those galleons, were 4 feet thick. They figured nothing could ever get through that. 4 feet of planks on the sides. He had 64 galleons built. Those were castles of the sea, floating castles. While they were doing this, of course, it was no big secret. I mean, how do you hide 2,000 miles of shipbuilding? So the English people asked, what are you doing over there? And Philip II said, well, we've got these miserable people we have to deal with, and we've decided we're going to take care of it once and for all. Don't worry about it. It has nothing to do with you. We're going the other direction. And so they'd see these big things being built and said, what is it you're doing? He said, I told you, we're going over there to take care of this. No big deal, no problem. And they believed it. So nobody bothered with them. So this went on, and they're building this fantastic machine. There had never been anything like this in the history of the world. This is the biggest navy that anyone has ever put together. But this wasn't all. The Duke of Parma, the mightiest general in Spain, which happened to have the best armies in the whole world at that time, was over in the Netherlands. And Philip II told him, put together an army over there with 400 ships. He says, and what we'll do when the time comes is I'll come up from Spain, you come around from the Netherlands, and we'll put England right in the middle, no problem. Now, we may not be able to appreciate what was being put together here because at that time, England had 28 boats. That's it. Now, I drew this little kind of course map here because Spain is down here, and this is France. The Netherlands is up here, Norway, Scotland, England, and Ireland. But this place in here, in the Netherlands, is where Parma was building his fleet, 400 boats inside here. Okay, so this is all being developed, and what's it for? Wipe out Protestantism. This is the Pope's way of dealing with the Protestants. He's going to get rid of them. He's got kings who will do things with him. He's got all the armies and navies and everything. He's going to get this done. Oh, I mean, what's 28 boats going to do? So they're building all of this. The Duke of Parma put together 30 regiments of Italians, 80 of the Dutch, 60 of the Spaniards, 6 of Germans, and 10 of the Walloons. He had people. So Sixtus V put out a bull against Elizabeth again, and this was her death decree. She was to die. The 12 lead ships of this vast armada were named after the apostles. This is a holy war. And the apostles are going to go out there to destroy the Protestants. The Marquis Santa Cruz, the mightiest admiral anywhere, was to lead this fleet. On the day the fleet sailed, he died. And so they had to look around for another admiral, and so the King of Spain decided, no, I'm not going to do that. He picked the richest man he could find. And he made him the head of the whole thing, Sidonia. But of course, he gave him several admirals to work with. They would actually do the real stuff, but he was the head of it because he was rich. So they started out. They went out and they came around Spain here, and they came around. And about 3 weeks out there, they hit a storm. It blew them all over the place. When the storm was over, they all came back together. But that was their first taste. As they moved out again, another storm hit them. It just blew them everywhere. And those big galleons, in particular, they were like corks. Just every place. Those sails did almost nothing for them. Well, finally they got through those 2 storms, and on the 30th of July, they came to the Channel. Now the English, by this time, had got wind that something's coming. There's something coming, and it's coming this way. Says, maybe we better make a preparation. So they started putting the word out, and the English people responded. People came from everywhere to be soldiers. I don't know how good they would have been, but they came anyhow. And the Queen decided to get her little navy together. She got together 33 boats. But she wouldn't give them any ammunition. That cost too much. It's too expensive. We'll give you the boats. And the other ones started coming out of nowhere, privateers. One of the famous one is Drake, Sir Francis Drake. He got together about 30 boats. You know, just little boats, but fast boats with small weapons on them. And so little by little, they developed a navy of 150 boats. Okay? We'd probably laugh at them if we could see them, but that was their navy for this war. Well, on the 30th, you know how the water is when you look out on the ocean. You can see maybe 20 miles out there. I don't know. That's about as far as you can see. They were watching in England, see what's out there. And sure enough, they could see a couple boats. And they kept watching. They see some more coming, and some more, and some more. And they couldn't believe what they saw. There was a line in the shape of a crescent, 7 miles from tip to tip, of this navy coming up. I said, oh, what are we going to do now? Well, Sidonia was watching all of this, and of course he was in the middle boat. Out here, this crescent. He's in this boat there, and he's in a armor-proof thing. Nothing can get through there. He's totally protected. And he's looking at England out there, and he looks at his boats and all that. And they're making their way slowly, and this is really slow stuff. I mean, just barely moving. When they finally reached the channel, 60 little ships went out there to meet him. The 7-mile line of boats, 60 little ships went out there. And they discovered something really fast. They had the wind that day, and so they could do anything they wanted in those sailboats. They could tack, they could maneuver, they could... And the big boats couldn't move. So here these big boats are coming, and these little boats are just whizzing all around and doing anything they want. And as they'd go by, they'd broadside them. The big boats would fire at them, but they're too tall. The fire goes right over. So these little boats got it really fast. Hey, we have an advantage here. It just harassed them all day long. They did a lot of damage, too. The big boats had chains wrapped around the masts. They thought they couldn't be hurt that way. But these little boats could take careful aim and knock off the tops of these things. And so they were starting to make firewood out of these boats. That night, after it was all over, Sidonia was really mad. And he went to the head gunner of their fleet, who happened to be a Flemish person. He had a real temper. And Sidonia told him, "You've been doing some stupid things. We haven't hit anything out there." He said, "Get your act together." And that Flemish commander really got upset. Well, he can't talk to me like that. He went straight to the powder room. He lit a match and he jumped out of the boat. Yeah. The deck blew off of this thing. Yeah. And of course the boat sank. Well, things are beginning to happen to this Navy because the money to pay all those soldiers was on that boat. Well, a lot of the powder and stuff. The second battle happened. On the third, nothing. They just looked at each other. On the fourth, they went out to fight again. And the reason they didn't fight on the third was because the wind changed. And the little boats couldn't move anymore. The big boats had the advantage, but it wasn't much because they could hardly move anyhow. They had little teeny sails for these big boats. And so the little boats didn't, they just stayed back and watched. But the wind changed on the 4th. And so out they went again. Broadsiding these boats, just every time they went by, they'd hit something. Just blowing them up. Finally, the boats got up in here, and they waited. Let's see. I guess it was up in this side. They were waiting. They were waiting for the Duke of Parma. I said, we'll just wait here. Let these people do whatever they want. We've got our army. We'll just step on the shore. It's over. We have our army with us. Well, what was happening to the Duke of Parma? They waited, and he didn't show. It didn't show. I said, what is going on here? We need him to come here because these people are really harassing us. We can still beat them and wipe them out, but this is a shame. They keep coming at us like this. The Duke of Parma was in here with his 400 boats, and the Netherlands Navy was here and wouldn't let them out. They didn't want Spain wiping out England because the Netherlands was Protestant. And it's strange. It's one of the things in history people can't figure out. Why didn't the Duke of Parma know he wouldn't be able to get out? So there he is, and that's where he stayed. He never got out of there. He knew that he could get out if he fought these people and blew them all up. But he also knew he'd be in big trouble if he already had a battle here before he got over there. So he just sent a message to the King of Spain and said, we can't get out. We can't get out. Very soon thereafter, after the 4th, I don't remember, August the 8th, I think, the English Navy had target practice with the Spanish Navy. They just went out there and they'd wave as they went by and then blow the ship and then go. It was a mess. The poor Spanish Navy was having a really bad time with this little navy from England. That night, everything was quiet. Just shortly past midnight, it was dark, no moon, nothing. The Spanish Navy had decided they had to clump together to protect their ships, and they would do that and throw anchors out. And there they were, all together for the night. And on this night, the night of the 8th, somebody saw something moving out there, and it was coming towards them. And then all of a sudden they could see very well, because it was 8 ships all strapped together with tar and pitch and everything, and the English people just lit it, and all of a sudden everybody could see this could be a fire boat. 8 of these boats together aimed right at the Spanish Armada that was anchored. And they saw that coming. Oh, they cut their chains and everything, and of course that let the boats loose. And it started blowing. There was a wind, and it just blew the boats around. It was a strange thing to see. They tried to get away from those fire boats, and in their fleeing, they went out this way into the German Sea, which is a lot bigger. I don't have this to scale. They got out here where the winds can really do the job on you. And when they went out there, Sir Francis Drake and his group started chasing them. But that's all they could do because they had run out of ammunition. They didn't have anything to shoot anymore. But the Spanish people didn't know that. So they're steering their ships and getting away as fast as they can. The whole Navy's leaving through there with these little boats coming after them with nothing to shoot. And finally they said, well, that's enough of that. So they turned around. Because the Spanish Navy disappeared into the dark, they couldn't see them anymore, and all of a sudden clouds started coming up, and a storm came out of nowhere, and just blew that whole Navy out into a place where sailors don't go. Yeah. And so the last thing they saw was the Spanish Navy being chased out of the world, and that's what they said. They were being chased out of the world. They were going into uncharted waters, unknown seas, and if those people were afraid on those boats, they had reason to, because that was a boat-wrecking place. It was full of rocks and cliffs and all kinds of things. And they lost several boats. Well, they went up around got up to where Norway is and came around the boats that were left after all that mess. And they came around on the west side of Ireland. And of course the Irish are Catholics. But didn't help one bit. The Irish didn't want them around there either. There was another storm and these boats started coming up against there. There are reports of that time that people would walk on the beaches. And on one beach, one 5-mile stretch of beach, they found 1,100 soldiers washed up on the shore. It's just one little stretch of beach. And there were several like that, all up and down there. By the thousands, these people were being killed out there in that water. All the admirals were dead. No one knew how to guide these ships. The rudders on most of these boats were broken. They were just being thrown by the wind. And people were dying left and right. Now, just for your information, there's lots of details in this. That army and that navy was the pride of the world at that time. They had never been defeated. They'd been in Africa. They'd been everywhere. They had never been defeated. And they had beautiful blue uniforms. Not just blue gingham blue like Levi's. We're talking about beautiful velour type material, beautiful uniforms. And they didn't have fake gold. They had real gold decorations all over it. They were beautiful uniforms because they were the best army. And so people started looking for these people washing up on shore so they could get those beautiful uniforms and that gold and everything. Well, lots of them didn't die. They made it to the shore. Well, they wish they had died, because when the Irish got a hold of them, they killed 3,000 of them. Same religion. Over 8,000 of them were killed by the time it was over in Ireland. The Black Cliffs got them for 11 days. The storm just battered them. Out of that entire armada, 30,000 people were left. 30,000 went from Spain, and 10,000 came back. Yeah, that's what it was. 10,000 came back in their battered little ships, made it back to Spain, and King Philip just could not believe it. He says, what happened? What happened? He went over to Pope Sixtus and he says, well, who knows what happened over there? I need that million crowns now. And the Pope looked at him and said, what are you talking about? I thought you said you'd give 1 million crowns for this. I said, yeah, if you did something, you did nothing but get battered boats out of this. I'm not giving you any money. The greatest attempt of the Vatican to destroy Protestantism went down the drain. Why do you suppose it did that? Queen of England called for a Thanksgiving Day. Fasting and prayer and Thanksgiving, November the 29th, 1588, all of England participated in a Thanksgiving. And they made coins saying, glory to God alone. They knew they didn't do anything. Who could do anything with that armada? Let's look at Exodus 14:21. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Okay. Now, go over to chapter 15, verse 10. Thou didst blow with thy wind. The sea covered them. They sank as lead in the mighty waters. Can God do that? I'll just blow in the wind. The water took care of the rest. Psalm 77. Verse 16. The waters saw thee. Oh God, the waters saw thee. They were afraid. The depths also were troubled. The clouds poured out water. The skies sent out a sound. Thine arrows also went abroad. The voice of thy thunder was in the heaven. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. Thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known. Psalm 93. Verse 3, the floods have lifted up, O Lord, the floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their waves. The Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters, yea, than the mighty waves of the sea. Thy testimonies are very sure. Holiness becometh thine house. And Psalm 104. Bless the Lord, O my soul, O Lord my God, thou art very great. Thou art clothed with honor and majesty. Who coverest thyself with light as with a garment, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, who layeth the beams of his chambers in the waters, who maketh the clouds his chariot, who walketh upon the wings of the wind. Well, we don't have to guess what happened to the Spanish Armada. The biggest plans of human beings, all God needs is a little wind. So that's the first Thanksgiving. Let's go back now to Abraham Lincoln's time. I'm going to read you some statements that deal with the spirit of prophecy. It says the announcement on January 6, 1863, that in a few days there would be available to Seventh-day Adventists testimony, with the lead article being on the war, and Adventist duty in relation to it, brought assurance to the hearts of many, especially men of draft age and their families. Whether the article was based on a single vision or on several, we do not know, but Ellen White's repeated reference to what she was shown or what she saw makes it clear that a vision or visions formed the immediate background. The visions at Parkville, Michigan, January 12, 1861. When did the Civil War begin? It was not in 1861. Seventh-day Adventists knew about the Civil War before it happened. Roosevelt, New York, August 3rd, 1861, at Battle Creek, January 4th, 1862, put Adventists in the unique position of knowing first of the coming war and the ferocity and long duration, and then its philosophy. Now, how many people in this world know what the actual philosophy of that war was? Seventh-day Adventists knew before it came. And we are the only people that really know and can say so. Because all the books have been changed. And the assurance that God had a controlling hand in the affairs of the nation. They had an inside view of the victories and losses and the potential of its becoming an international conflict. Did you know that Satan tried to make that into the First World War? See there? Adventists know things nobody else knows. Now, a year later, there was further light for the church. By the way, if you would like to get into this for yourself, I'm reading some things from Volume 2 of the biographies of Ellen White and James White. Okay? And I'm reading from a section in page 46, and then I'm going to jump around to other places. But if you want more information, you can dig through there, and it's a continuity. Now, a year later, there was further light for the church, whose members regarded as binding the claims of the Ten Commandments, and who now face the prospects of a national military draft. So this is what's coming here, a draft. What should the Adventists do about the draft? It had never happened before. And they're trying to figure this out. True to its advance notice, it contained counsel as to how Seventh-day Adventists should relate to the war. There was as yet no national draft. The men in the army had volunteered for military service, thus surrendering all claims that they might have to positions of conscience. It was on this basis that Ellen White wrote as she did. Conscription, although a real threat, was yet months away.
Was the church a church yet?
Yeah, but not the way we know it today. It was an organized church, yes. As a matter of fact, there was a problem, since you asked the question, to the organization, because during that time, when they did make the draft, we're not there yet, but when they did make the draft, they had some provisions that if you didn't want to go, you could send somebody else. So if you could get somebody to go for you and you were drafted, you didn't have to go. Now, barring that, after a while, they made another law. They said you could buy your way out. If you had conscientious scruples, you could pay $300, and they would let you off the hook. Now, we're talking about $300 back then. I mean, $300 is a lot of money. But if you had the money, you could buy your way out. So at first, what the church started doing was paying the $300 to keep the Adventists out of the service. Now, can you imagine if this church was invited to keep a few of their young men out of the service? They would just have to pay $50,000 apiece and no problem. I mean, how many offerings would it take? And then after you got the offerings, what would be left? That's where the church was, because that's what they did. They started paying the $300 to keep the Adventists out of the service. And it didn't take long for the churches to just about go bankrupt. So you can begin to see the plan. The devil is out to destroy the Adventist movement with the Civil War. That's something else the churches don't know anything about out there, and I don't know how many Adventists know it. The devil stepped in again to destroy God's message. In the Review and Herald, August 12th, 1862, these words.
I find it kind of ironic that all that information was on page 46, with 46 being the number of God.
On page 46, yeah. Right.
Were there Adventists in the South? And if there were, what would they do?
Okay, this is why this is a major problem, because we got both sides here. You're going to have Adventists fighting Adventists if they get involved. Let's see how Ellen White tried to deal with this. because it was not an easy thing at first. James White wrote on the subject of the draft before it happened, and he wrote before she had a vision. Yeah. He wrote an article called The Nation, and the church really came down on him. They said, "You don't know what you're talking about." I'll read you a little bit of it. Let's see what we get to here. But first, she said this: "The position which our people have taken relative to the perpetuity and sacredness of the law of God contained in the Ten Commandments is not in harmony with all the requirements of war." The fourth precept of that law says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." The sixth says, "Thou shalt not kill." But in the case of drafting, the government assumes the responsibility. Oh, wait a minute. What happened here? But in the case of drafting, the government assumes the responsibility of the violation of the law of God. Now get that. And it would be madness to resist. He who would resist until in the administration of military law he was shot down goes too far, we think, in taking the responsibility of suicide. That's what James White said in the Review and Herald. And the church members, the conservative ones, they came down and said, "You don't know what you're talking about. That can't be from God." Well, I wonder how you would have related to this article if he had said to you, "Don't commit suicide, that's stupid." Do you know that our church actually got embroiled in a debate, and there are 2 Seventh-day Adventist churches today because of it? Yeah, the devil did it again in the First World War. The General Conference put out the word, "It's a matter of your conscience. We will not legislate how you relate to this war." And a branch of the Conservative Adventists says that's not good enough. We have to follow the Bible. Then they left, and today they're called the Reformed Seventh-day Adventist Church. That's why that church exists. It was over this issue. Because they had Germans, Seventh-day Adventists, and they had American Seventh-day Adventists. And what are you going to do when Germans and Americans get together in a war? All right, somebody had a hand. Yes.
Just to clarify this again, are you saying that the position of James White was for Seventh-day Adventists not to participate in the Civil War? And this was a result in causing a split in the earlier ages with the church?
No. It was the First World War that happened. But this is the first time the issue came up to us as a people. The reason we did not divide here was because Ellen White stepped in with a vision. That's coming next.
Oh.
Okay. All right. All right. Now, it says by August, I'm going to read you a little more on this. I'm going to back up. By August 1862, it seemed to James White that something must be said. He placed an editorial in the Review and Herald titled "The Nation." In this article, he expressed his own opinion of the responsibility for the acts of the drafted soldiers. This was to cause considerable controversy. He wrote, "We are at present enjoying the protection of our civil and religious rights by the best government under heaven." I want that to sink in before we move on. He's talking about the government under the Union. He is not talking about the South. Okay, that's important. With the exception of those enactments pressed on it by the slave power, its laws are good. Now, did you notice how he worded that? By the slave power. What is the slave power? There's something here that we don't know today. There was somebody behind slavery. And it was not just the tobacco people. There was something behind them. And James White knew it. And I think a lot of people knew it back then before they rewrote the history books. The slave power. Let's read a little more. Whatever we may say of our amiable president, and they really appreciated Lincoln, the Seventh-day Adventists, his cabinet, or of military officers, it is Christ-like to honor every good law of our land. Said Jesus, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Those who despise civil law should at once pack up and be off for some spot on God's footstool where there is no civil law. He was taught. Now, in explanation, defense of James White's position, ventured on the draft when it should come. A few weeks later, Ellen White, in the heat of a very earnest discussion with various ones who were divided in the matter of responsibility, she said this: I was shown the excitement created among our people by the article in the Review headed The Nation. Some understood it in one way and some another. The plain statements were distorted and made to mean what the writer did not intend. He gave the best light that he then had. It was necessary that something be said. So we just got some clarification historically here, okay? During those times, she's saying, somebody needed to say something. He said it, and it's the best information he had. Now, let's go on. The Review article of August 26 carried an appeal. This was James White's making the appeal for any well-written articles calculated to shed light upon our duty as a people in reference to the present war. So he was open. Says, Mrs. T.M. Stewart of Wisconsin had written to Ellen White inquiring on some points relating to the war and the draft that seemed imminent. Ellen answered this August 19th, just a week after the editorial had appeared, without special light on the matter, a fact she clearly acknowledged. She advocated a moderate stance. So clear up to this point, God hasn't said anything to them, and they're just saying, well, be careful. Don't become a radical here. Don't become... All right, continuing. I am not settled in regard to taking up arms, but this looks consistent to me. I think it would please the enemy for us to obstinately refuse to obey the law of our country when this law is not against our religious faith, and sacrifice our lives. It looks to me that Satan would exult to see us shot down so cheaply, for our influence could not have a salutary influence upon beholders as the death of martyrs. No, all would think we served just right because we would not come to the help of our imperiled country. Were our religious faith at stake, we should cheerfully lay down our lives and suffer for Christ. Now is the time we are to be tested and the genuineness of our faith proved. Those who have merely professed the faith without an experience will be brought into a trying place. Young and old should now seek for an experience in the things of God. A superficial work will not avail now. We must have the principles of truth wrought deep in the soul and practice it in our life, and then we shall be girded with strength in the day of trouble and conflict before us. In 1886, Ellen White stated this: you inquire in regard to the course which should be pursued to secure the rights of our people to worship according to the dictates of their own conscience. This has been the burden of my soul for some time, where there would be denial of our faith and an evidence that our trust is not fully in God. But I call to mind many things God has shown me in the past in regard to things of a similar character, as the draft. I can speak in the fear of God. It is right we should use every power we can to avert the pressure that's brought to bear upon our people. She eventually came out and said, after God showed her, we can have nothing to do with this unjust war. Okay. So she told our people that we were to resist picking up weapons, that we should not do that. And that's been our position ever since as a people, that we should not pick up weapons. But the church has taken the position that it will not tell a person, you cannot do this and you cannot do that. They leave it up to the conscience of the person. If you are a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, then you will not kill. That's it. It's between you and God. Well, as things went along, and I don't want to get there too quick. I want to read something from Volume 1 of the Testimonies. And I want you to realize with me that this is Volume 1. This is not hidden someplace. It's right there in everybody's libraries in the very first book. January 4th, 1862. I was shown. This is page 253. I was shown some things in regard to our nation. My attention was called to the Southern Rebellion. What did she call it? Rebellion. Who's the chief rebel?
Satan.
This thing that came out of the South came out of the devil's mind. No Southerner wants to know that. This has more to do than with guns and heritage and culture. The devil's involved in this. He wanted to get rid of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he used the South to do it. But he had lots of help. It was the Catholic Church pushing the leadership of the South. Yeah, the Catholic Church is here again. If you begin to investigate every rotten war that we have records for in modern times, the Catholic Church is right there. Vietnam? Yeah, right there. I won't go into that. That's another subject. But I'm going to read to you what God said through the Spirit of prophecy about the Civil War. The South had prepared themselves for a fierce conflict, while the North was asleep. Before President Lincoln's administration commenced. When? Before Lincoln became the president. Before President Lincoln's administration commenced, great advantage was taken by the South. The former administration planned and managed for the South to rob the North of the implements of war. She said the former administration. The people in Washington, before Lincoln came in, planned for the South to get weapons to start this war. You couldn't put this in the newspapers today. They had two objects for so doing. They were contemplating a determined rebellion. When they should rebel too, the North would be wholly unprepared. They would thus gain time, and by their violent threats and ruthless course, they thought they would so intimidate the North, they would be obliged to yield to them and let them have everything their own way. So the scene is set here to hate Lincoln before he ever comes in. This poor man stepped into this plan. The North did not understand the bitter, dreadful hatred of the South toward them, and were not prepared for their deep-laid plots. See, it never occurred to them. Their minds didn't work that way in the North. Most men, because we're going to get to some of the Northerners too before we're done here. Okay.
Who was the previous administration?
Who was the president before Lincoln? My mind is not giving me the name now. It'll come. The North had no just idea of the strength of the accursed system of slavery. It is this and this alone which lies at the foundation of the war. The South have been more and more exacting. They consider it perfectly right to engage in human traffic, to deal in slaves and the souls of men. To deal in the souls of men? Where does that come from? Okay. They are annoyed and become perfectly exasperated. If they cannot claim all the territory they desire, they would tear down the boundaries and bring their slaves to any spot they please and curse the soil with slave labor. The language of the South has been imperious, and the North have not taken suitable measures to silence it. Now you'll notice these words were written during this time. I would say it took a lot of guts to write this kind of stuff and put yourself out there where people could look at it and know that this was our church position. There are people today who won't say anything. That'll get people riled up because, oh, don't do that. Well, I have lots of quotations that talk about who those people are and why they're doing it. Continuing. The North have been preparing for war ever since, but the rebellion has been steadily increasing, and there is now no better prospect of its being subdued than there was months ago. So everything was set up. The North was taken by surprise. They couldn't prepare. Thousands have lost their lives. Many have returned to their homes, maimed and crippled for life, their health gone, their earthly prospects forever blighted, and yet how little has been gained. Thousands have been induced to enlist that with the understanding that this war was to exterminate slavery. But now that they are fixed, they find they have been deceived, and the object of this war is not to abolish slavery, but to preserve it as it is. Yeah, we're talking about the North now. The people in the North who went to fight this and say, let's stop this slavery thing in the South. They didn't know that there were people in Washington who had this war going on the North side to keep slavery going because they had interests in the South. And the soldiers that were dying didn't know this. Please don't think that's the first time it's happened. Do any of you know the name Eisenhower? Does the name Normandy mean anything to you? June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. That never needed to happen. The head of the SS, a year and a half before that time, I'm talking about the top man, went to the ambassador of the Netherlands and he said, send President Roosevelt this message. We will surrender the German army to him right now. Take Hitler out. The war should have ended a year and a half before. That message was given. It was delivered and it was never answered. That message was sent 3 times to President Roosevelt and it was never answered. They got tired of waiting over there in Germany for America's answer for their surrender, and so they tried to kill Hitler with an assassination plot. We know it failed. And Hitler killed over 200 of the people that he could round up that he found out did this. Normandy did not need to happen. And when it did happen, this is all history. Eisenhower was interviewed and he said, we know what it's going to cost to take that beach. Thousands and thousands of American boys are going to die. Sign the paper. Go.
At that time, are we seeing now that most of the people that are in our government have vested interest into German companies that were making machinery for Hitler? Consequently, they proceed in engaging the war a little longer at the expense of all of our young men's lives.
That's right. That's not our subject. We have a message to give this world, but we can't be dumb about these things. We've got to know what really has happened so we don't get caught up in this false heroism, this false national loyalty and all of this. We belong to Jesus Christ. We can't turn our heads and say, well, I don't want to know that. I'll believe the fairy tales like everybody else. We need to tell people about the third angel's message, and we should have good reasons to do that. It's the only truth. Don't get involved in tearing down personalities in history or nations. That's not why I'm telling you these things. It doesn't help anybody to do that. But we must know these things so when people talk to us about certain things, we can just know, yeah, right. No, let's stay with the real thing here. Okay. Those who have ventured to leave their homes and sacrifice their lives to exterminate slavery are dissatisfied. They see no good results from the war, only the preservation of the Union. And for this, thousands of lives must be sacrificed and homes made desolate. Okay, I'm not going to keep reading this entire section. I just want to read little sections here. On page 255, it says, valuable men have thus been sacrificed to get rid of their strong anti-slavery influence. Yeah, purposely put in certain places to get rid of them. Some of the very men whom the North most need in this critical time, whose services would be the highest value, are not. They're gone. The prospects before a nation are discouraging, for there are those filling responsible stations who are rebels at heart. There are commanding officers in the Union Army who are rebels. And sympathy with the rebels. While they are desirous of having the Union preserved, they despise those who are anti-slavery. Now this was revealed to her by God. Union commanders. You know, when the slaves would be free, they'd come through the lines. And they'd come over to the Union armies. Those commanders would say, hey, you get on back there, you're a slave. And force them to go back. It seems impossible to have the war conducted successfully, for many in our own ranks are continually working to favor the South, and our armies have been repulsed and unmercifully slaughtered on account of the management of these pro-slavery men. Some of our leading men in Congress also are constantly working to favor the South. No, that's been in our books the whole time. This is reality. This is not history books the way they put them out in your schools. This is the real thing. We need to understand reality the way God wants us to understand things. All right, I'm going to skip. Page 258. Our government has been very proud and independent. The people of this nation have exalted themselves to heaven and have looked down upon monarchical governments and triumphed in their boasted liberty. While the institution of slavery, that was 1,000 times worse than the tyranny exercised by monarchical governments, was suffered to exist and was cherished. In this land of light, a system is cherished which allows one portion of the human family to enslave another portion, degrading millions of human beings to the level of brute creation. The equal of this sin is not to be found in heathen nations. Said the angel. Oh, now we have an angel talking. Hear, O heavens, the cry of the oppressed, and reward the oppressors double according to their deeds. That's straight from God. She says, this nation will yet be humbled into the dust. Because of slavery. And do you know Lincoln understood that from reading the Bible? I'll read it to you. He said it. He published it. All right. All right, just briefly. England still was not happy about our becoming independent. And England was watching all of this. They're thinking, how can we get over there and take over that government? We'll take the country back. Well, that's what England was thinking about. But they couldn't get very far with it because France was behind them over there, and France was waiting for them to make a mistake so they could go over to England. And so Europe wasn't enough foment to keep us alone over here with this mess. This almost turned into a world war. Okay, I'm going to go to page 350. Well, it starts on 355. I'm not going to read there. Satan was the first great leader in rebellion. This is 359. God is punishing the north. Before, she said, this country's going to be humbled. And now on this page, she says, God is punishing the north. There's one famous battle. It was called the Battle of Manasseh. During that battle, the armies were pretty evenly matched. And the northern army came against the southern army and was pounding it. They had the advantage. They were going to wipe it out when all of a sudden something happened. And historians don't know what it was. They just know something strange happened. All of a sudden, the northern army turned around and started retreating. And the southern army recovered and went after them. And things like this were happening in the Civil War. And historians don't realize God was doing things to prolong the war. He was punishing both sides. Ellen White saw it in vision. She said she saw the north beating the south. And then all of a sudden, there was a strange running backwards. And then she said, I saw what it was. An angel stood between the two armies and raised his hand and put confusion every place, and the northern army ran off. Does God have a part in the nations? Is he really in control?
Yet be humbled.
It was part of it. It's not over yet. Yeah, we're not done with it. On page 359 it says this, God is not with the South. Those poor Southerners don't know that. You know the same Spirit is still there? She said so. The spirit of slavery is still in the South. God is not with the South, and he will punish them dreadfully in the end. Satan is the instigator of all rebellion. So I didn't make it up that Satan was behind that. He is the rebel. And when they put up their rebel flags, they're saying, this is who we belong to, the rebel. Please read these pages in their entirety for yourself. I'm just reading you little sections here because you may not see them. The eye somehow misses these statements as we go by. She says that same thing on page 360. I'm not going to read it. On page 361, I was shown that God's people, who are his peculiar treasure, cannot engage in this perplexing war, for it is opposed to every principle of their faith. In the army, they cannot obey the truth and at the same time obey the requirements of their officers. So this is why the church began paying for all the men to be not there. But it was putting the church in a strange place. They were losing all the money. So one way or another, the church was being destroyed. Many were blinded and grossly deceived in the last election. And their influence was used to place in authority men who would wink at evil. Men who would witness a flood of woe and misery and mood, whose principles are corrupt to our Southern sympathizers and would preserve slavery as it is. In positions of trust in the Northern Army, there are men who are rebels at heart, who value the life of a soldier no more than they would the life of a dog. They can see them torn and mangled and dying by thousands unmoved. The officers of the Southern Army are constantly receiving information in regard to the plans of the Northern Army. All right, that's all I'm going to read. That section goes to page 368. You might want to look at it and get caught up on real history. That's just 2 testimonies, by the way. She wrote more. All right, I'm going to finish this section now with some of these comments. I mentioned that the brethren are to have a fast on February the 11th. It says here, the General Conference was gratified with the article presented by Brother White. They endorsed the position he's taken, recommended to all our brethren to observe Sabbath, February 11th, as a day of fasting and prayer for the object specified in the said article. On October the 20th, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, proclaimed the last Thursday in November next as a day of thanksgiving and prayer to Almighty God, the beneficent creator and ruler of the universe. It was a day for humility and pleading with God for peace, union, and harmony throughout the land. While this is all going on, this is what the general people are saying. We are thus brought, as it plainly appears to us, to a place where if the war continues, we must stop. We've got to stop being a church. We repeat it. The war must stop, or our work of spreading the truth must stop. Which shall it be? By mid-February 1865, it was clear to the committee that if the war did not come to an early close, and if there was to be a call for more men every 5 or 6 months, we must inevitably lose means, or lose our own numbers, and lose those who would embrace the truth, and lose the attention of the people. President Lincoln, in his second inaugural address given on March 4th, 1865, acknowledged the scourge of the war as a result of the crime of slavery. Here are his words. Fondly we do hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with a lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So he said, we have it coming. As long as we've had slavery, that's how long God can punish us and everything's right. Then he said this, we would recommend, nay more, earnestly request all our churches and scattered brethren to set apart 4 days commencing Wednesday. I'm sorry, that's out of context. This is what James White said. 4 days commencing Wednesday, March 1st, continuing to the close of the following Sabbath as days of earnest and importune prayer over the subject. Let business be suspended and the churches meet at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on each of the weekdays and twice on Sabbath to pour out their supplications before God. And the whole church did it. The church did that for 4 days. And Lincoln got the nation to do it on Thanksgiving. On April 9th, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox in Virginia. The war was virtually over. There were still some activities to be quelled for the South. It said, but at Lee's surrender, Editor Smith of the Review, recognizing the visible answer to prayer, wrote cautiously of the prospects of peace. It says, while the loyal North is rejoicing in the downfall of Richmond, the signal successes of the Union arms, and the apparent nearness of the complete overthrow of the rebellion, and the consequent peace, none have more reason to rejoice than the commandment-keeping people of God, and none can rejoice more understandingly than they. They see in the prospect not only the immediate effects that others see, the cessation of slaughter and bloodshed, but they see in it a fulfillment of prophecy, an answer to prayer, a bright token that the great shepherd of Israel is going before his flock. We therefore thank God for the visible manifestation of his hand in our national affairs. So there's 2 Thanksgivings. The people knew God did something. We've got one more Thanksgiving coming. Yeah. But it's only going to be for the people that know God's going to do it again. Okay? And it's going to be the same people involved. The Vatican is on the move. And they're after the same thing. Get rid of Adventists. The Vatican doesn't care one bit about the Lutherans, the Nazarenes, the Methodists. None of them. They don't care. It's the Adventists they want. And the Pope is going to run this whole world. That's where he's headed. And when he gets there, he's going to declare us all outlaws. And the world's going to listen. They're going to say, Papa, Father. Gorbachev went over to the Vatican and he looked the Pope in the eye and said, Holy Father. Gorbachev right now is the head of the biggest organization on this planet to make peace come to this world. And he's got people from every nation coming. Gorbachev is his right-hand man now. Ted Turner is doing his bit. He's got the money to make things happen, and he's doing it. He's calling together all the witches and the shamans and all the necromancers for the new age. It just happened recently. It was in Time magazine. Pictures. This stuff is happening just the way God said. Don't try to understand history based on the books you can get a hold of today. You're not going to find it. We have the spirit of prophecy. Whatever you can dig out there, that's what's real. But the issues are going to be right in front of us. You know, I read a statement today that gave me a lot of courage. It says when persecution comes, the zeal of the real commandment people, keeping people of God will increase. Yeah, she doesn't say it might happen. She says that's what's going to bring it out. She says that which is in the person who's a commandment keeper all of a sudden will come out. So we don't have to worry about commandment keepers doing something when this comes down. We need to know we're commandment keepers now, so we'll be ready for that. We'll be part of it. Okay, I thought that might be a little helpful to you to see history unfolding a little bit. Modern history, today, not just Moses. Not just Paul and John and all that, but right now, today, it's going on. Same thing. So let's get involved the same way. We haven't been asked to do anything yet. None of us may ever be asked to stand up and burn. It may never happen to any of us, but it could. God could say, I want you to stand up and say, this is how real it is. Light the torch. Okay, let's up right. Oh, I have a question.
Brother Ortega, do you have any time for questions?
Okay, we'll try. Depends on what the questions are. We may not want them on the tape. Our subject is complete now. Yeah, let me see what the questions are. Go ahead.